So it is my absolute pleasure to be connecting with all of you virtually tonight. I wish it could be in person, but the upside is we get to do a lot of these fun events with people from all over the country and all over the world. So there is a definite plus side to virtual events. We want it to be as interactive as possible. So please remember, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and I will talk with Laura. It is being recorded, so hopefully if all goes well, we'll be able to share this link with people on our Wildcat Hub, which is our alumni, all things alumni for Williston. I think that's it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Laura. Laura is a Massachusetts native who grew up with a curiosity for all things culinary. She attended Williston Northampton School and graduated in 2013. From a young age, she was granted fierce independence in the kitchen, which ultimately led to her work in professional kitchens throughout high school. She attended the Culinary Institute of America, and during her time there, she fell in love with the world of wine. During her early 20s, she spent time cooking and learning about wine in Hudson Valley, New York, Napa Valley, California, and the north of France. Laura has most notably trained in the kitchens of Blue Hill at Stone Barns in Tarrytown, New York, and Robert Sinsky Vineyards in Napa, California. In 2018, Laura moved back to Western Mass to open an intimate catering company called Blue Door Gatherings. And as an aside, we've used Laura Blue Door Gatherings for a lot of Williston events, and it's amazing, amazing. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Laura has partnered with Coco and the Cellar Bar for a collaborative takeout business. In June 2020, Laura started a second business venture with Uni Abkin called Tula. Tula's mission is to create a plant-based, nutrient-dense diet that supports a balanced lifestyle and healthy body. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Laura Bowman and her famous fall apple galette.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and have you virtually in my kitchen space in Holyoke. I'm, like I said, really missing people in this space, especially in the winter. We do typically have a lot of supper clubs and private dinners here that kind of keep our kitchen busy throughout the winter. Because normally my business is focused on doing weddings, and so we're often traveling from kind of out towards Boston to the Berkshires, doing from small to 200 people events, and we kind of take the summer and fall to focus on that. But and then in the winter, we kind of have time to do some more fun and creative classes in this space, and have wine dinners and collaborate with other local businesses. So it's been fun to kind of step into this virtual world a little bit and work with Williston and some other like provisions in Northampton we've been doing some classes with. So it's really fun, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm sorry I don't have a tech crew here to have an overhead camera and some other different shots, but if you need to see anything close up, I'm happy to kind of walk around and show it to you as we do this. And as Tammy said, please feel free to ask questions and be as interactive as you would like. It definitely makes it more enjoyable for me if I'm interacting with you. So these are just some tarts that came out of the oven. So I'm going to put them aside, but I just wanted to show you kind of what we're working on. This is the tart that you have the recipe for. And then I'm going to show you some other variations. This one is really pretty. It's an all cranberry one, very Thanksgiving holiday focused. And I think it would look beautiful on the center of your table this holiday, however many people you have. So I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about equipment. And you'll notice on the recipe that went out that that's sort of the first section. And I think it's really important and worth talking about because having kind of the right setup can set you up for success and make all the difference in the final product. So this recipe you can make completely by hand. You don't need an electric mixer. I'm going to show you both methods because I think that there is some convenience to be had with the mixer, but I think that knowing how to mix a dough by hand is a great skill. And you can, tart dough is so versatile. You can make savory or sweet applications with it. So that being said, I'm going to just show you some of my favorite tools. And if you don't have all of them, there's definitely room for creativity. So the first thing I'll talk about is the rolling pins. My personal preference is a French rolling pin. It's this kind of thinner wooden rolling pin that's tapered on both ends. And I think it gives you a lot of control. You can kind of get a good feel for how thin the dough is. And I think once you start working with it, you'll find that your doughs are much more even when you roll them out. So this is my personal preference, but I think that finding the right rolling pin for you, if it works for you, that's great. If you get the final product comes out successful, then keep doing what you're doing. This is my mom's preference, actually, is using this kind of marble rolling pin that has ball bearings, so the middle spins, whereas the handles actually stay in place. So when you roll it, the handles aren't moving, and you're just pushing downward. And that is going to give you, it's going to feel easier to roll the dough out. You're not working it as much, but I do find it's harder to control the shape of your dough. So not my preference, but again, totally works. They also make these, I should say, with a sturdy middle, so you roll it and the middle doesn't turn around, and that's great too. That's sort of mimicking the French style rolling pin. And then I think these are really fun and definitely, more of a boutique rolling pin, but they actually are measured out so that this will give you, if you roll it to all the way out, you will have 1/4 of an inch dough, and this one is just 1/8 of an inch. So if you have trouble kind of estimating the size or the thickness of your dough, and you want to have a final product that feels even all the way around, and you're not finding success with another rolling pin, these are a great tool to have, especially if you're making a lot of pie dough. This is something that will kind of speed the process. So I will put these away and we'll keep that one out. And then just some other things. I love having a bench scraper. I think it's great when you're making dough by hand, especially if you're using a surface to kind of work the dough into one cohesive piece. This is great. It's also great for cleaning your surface into the trash. And you can also use it as a cutting tool. And this still has tape on it from when I was in culinary school. And everyone had the same thing. So mine still has my magenta tape on it, but it still does the job. And you can use it to cut your butter. You can cut off pieces of dough if it's if you have a weird piece and you need to cut it into a better shape. This is definitely worth having. If you don't have a metal one, a plastic one is also great. It does the same job of scraping, kind of scrapes things out of the bowl, and you can bend it nice and easily. So there's that. I love having a small pair of kitchen scissors. It's great for trimming dough if you need to, or opening packages or anything like that. Great to have around. A whisk. It doesn't have to be this small, but I just like this size for mixing the flour together. Having a fork is great for crimping the dough. It's also great for whisking your egg wash and things like that, which you'll also need a pastry brush or even a paintbrush. And if you don't have this, you can use your fingers, or you can get creative with like a paper towel or something like that. So not necessary. Another thing I love having is a little offset spatula. It's great if you're making a tart that has a savory filling, and you're spreading some ricotta, or you're spreading some brandy ham for a tart or something like that, which I'm going to show you later. So I think this is a really good thing to have always on hand. And
Laura, I
then,
have a question for you.
sure.
What is your favorite resource to buy kitchen tools?
Great. So back when I was in school, I would be going to New York City a lot, and there's a lot of shops there that just had like, tons and tons of things. So that was like my favorite place to go because you're supporting these kind of smaller businesses, and some of them have online shops. Like I love Corin. That's where I get my knives from. So that's a great resource. Honestly, right now I've been getting a lot of things for better or worse on Amazon for convenience, and sometimes often need things very quickly. And it's nice to not have to go into a store for any unnecessary reason right now. So definitely been doing some online shopping. But there's also in Northampton, there's the Baker's Pin, which has some great specialty tools. So if you're looking for something like this dough cutter or something and you want it today, you could go there and get it. So yeah, that being said, this is a dough cutter. And if you're making doughs by hand and you feel like you always have like very warm hands and kind of run hot, this is a great tool to have because you're not going to warm up the butter or whatever fat you might be using in your dough. Yeah, and then I think having a knife on hand for cutting fruit is great. You don't need to have a large chef knife. You can use a paring knife or anything like that works as long as it's sharp and kind of cuts through and gives you a nice clean cut. Then that's great. You could also use a mandolin, which I'm going to show you for cutting apples. I think that is great if you're trying to do some detailed work, which I can actually show you. I'm just going to step and grab a tart in the refrigerator. But this was a tart I made just a little while ago today. I can bring it up here. But to get the apples really thin like this, and if you want some kind of detail work, I'm trying to show you without dumping it on the floor. Kind of making those rosette kind of style apples, you would want to use something like a mandolin. You can definitely do it by hand, but I think that you'll find it's very tedious already to do this, and I'll show you how you can do this later. So I think that having something like a mandolin is going to save you a lot of time and make it more enjoyable to do something like this. So I'm actually going to throw this in the oven. Hopefully I don't forget about it as I'm talking to you. And you can see the final baked product. Okay, so I hope I didn't miss anything. If I did, I will show you as I keep going. But the next thing I wanted to talk about is sourcing your ingredients. And since we're focusing on making an apple tart today, I want to spend some time talking about fruit and picking that out. My favorite place right now to get local apples is, well, you can go to the farmers markets if you have them, if you're lucky to live in a place that has kind of a seasonal year-round market. That's a great place to find a wide variety and find the freshest apples. So that would be my top choice. And my second choice is going to a local co-op grocery store or like a local grocery store, locally owned grocery store, because they often have a bigger variety of apples to select from, such as like River Valley Co-op if you're local to Western Mass, or even Atkins would be a great place, just to give yourself some different varieties to work with. And if not, the grocery store is fine to get any sort of conventional or organic apples. They'll all do the job. I think that the best way to store them is to make sure that when you buy them, that they're pretty cold to the touch. The skin feels firm. It's not like you can indent your hand in it. And it smells fragrant. It should smell like an apple. I would say something like this it's like your kind of conventional Granny Smith apple that has like a wax coating, that's not going to make a great apple to bake with, because even it's not even a great apple to eat because you get a mouthful of that kind of tannic, chewy skin. Just imagine if you're baking something like that, it's not going to be the most delicious option. Same with an apple that's sort of like your traditional Golden Delicious or something like this, where the flesh is really mealy, kind of like it doesn't have a lot of crunch or texture. That's not going to be a great option for baking either. It might be great for baking it down into, let's say, like an apple butter or something like that, or even dehydrating. But I wouldn't choose these as my apple for a galette. I would say that, you have a pretty wide selection of apples that you could use for this. Some of my preferred varietals would be these Honey Crisps are great. They have a great crisp texture, hence the name. And they're very aromatic, kind of sweet apples, and they have a beautiful color. I think these, for something like that rosette apple, where you see the color of the skin, is a great choice. Something like a Macintosh is going to have great flavor. It breaks down really easily, so using a combination of apples sometimes is great, because if you want the crisp texture of the Honey Crisp but the flavor of the Macintosh, you could use both, because I think that you'll get a more interesting final product and a more delicious final product. This is a Northern Spy apple. This is kind of a New England specialty apple, one of the oldest varieties. Very good for storing. So if you go apple picking and you can pick these and hold on to them for a long time for the season, that would be a great option. This is a Darcy spice apple. So it's very aromatic, fragrant, has a lot of interesting things going on. So this might be a great one to add into the mix and give yourself a nice bouquet of aromas and flavor.
Laura, I have one question regarding the apples while you're on them. Can you cook using McCown apples?
Sorry, I missed that.
Is it McCown? MACOUN?
Oh, yeah,
McCown?
Yeah, yes. I know what you're talking about. Yes. I don't. Now I'm questioning how to say it.
I am.
That's okay. Yes, you can definitely use that. And Portlands are great as well for baking, which I have right here. And then just some other fun heirlooms that I have here. This is a Black Oxford native to Maine, and they call them the rock because they're really hard. So they have like a really firm texture, a really dark skin. They're also fun if you want to use, I think sometimes it's really fun to have different colors. I like to, especially if if they are local apples, there's a good chance that they were picked recently, and so the skin is going to be not as tannic and not so thick, and so you can actually just, if you're cutting your apples thin enough, you can just keep the skin on them. That being said, if you don't like that that texture, or having that desired look, you can peel them. I'm not going to today, but don't let that stop you from peeling them. And then I also just threw in some pears, because I think having apples and pears together in a tart, any sort of orchard fruit, goes really nicely together and would make a beautiful looking tart. So I'll put these aside, but I'm happy to sort of talk more in depth about the apples if that is helpful. The other thing I wanted to mention is picking out flours and just making sure that they are good for the recipe. You definitely want an all-purpose flour. I prefer using King Arthur flour out of it's a local flour from Vermont, and I also use their whole wheat flour, and I have kind of designed and engineered all my recipes around these. Different flours are going to have different protein levels of protein and have slightly different structure. So, if you find a flour that you just keep in your house, it's good to just kind of restock with the same flour, whatever you use, just for consistency in your baking. But that being said, King Arthur flour does have a higher protein content, and so the dough needs to be hydrated more. So sometimes you'll find that it might be drier. Your baked things might be drier initially when you switch over to something that's a higher protein flour. But
oh, sorry, Laura, but if somebody didn't typically use wheat flour, is there a substitute that they could use?
Yeah, so if you don't have, I should start by saying if you don't typically have wheat flour in your house, you don't even need to add it in this recipe. The reason I like to add wheat is because I think it amplifies the flavor. Just adding a quarter cup, which is, just like a small percentage of the overall flour for the crust, is going to give it a little bit more. It gives it a little bit something else that isn't just like a traditional butter pie dough. It's a little bit more aromatic. It is kind of earthier, kind of has this wholesome kind of flavor to it, which I really like. And I actually add a lot of whole wheat to a lot of my baked products. Gives it a slightly darker color when you bake it, which I think is beautiful. So there's a few reasons why I just add that quarter cup. But if you don't have it, you could substitute it with a rye flour. You wouldn't want to use anything too specialized, like a spelt or teff or quinoa flour or anything like that, because all of those doughs have their own properties and they're going to completely throw off your dough if you're following this recipe. If you wanted to use something like a rye, you might want to find a pie recipe that uses rye dough, because chances are you're going to have to hydrate the dough more with water and butter. So it's going to change the proportion of that. But this recipe, since it's only a quarter cup, if you don't have it, just substitute it with the all-purpose flour and you'll have the same result. You just won't have that flavor from the whole wheat. Let me just move these back over here. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the vinegar in the dough. And you might notice that maybe your grandmother or someone in your family made pie dough with vodka or even just like distilled white vinegar. And the reason for that is because some people say that it makes the dough flakier. I think a lot of it has to do with flavor. And vinegar is a flavor enhancer, just like salt is. It's an acid, and so it's going to amplify the flavor of the dough and kind of give it its own. You want the dough to bring something to the dessert. You bring something to the table and kind of stand alone as a delicious product. And so I think adding a vinegar is a great option. And I love this Carr's Cider House vinegar. That would be my preferred choice for this recipe. I also think because we're making an apple tart, using a cider vinegar is a great marriage for this.
Laura, I have a couple questions right now. One is, what's the difference between apple cider vinegar and regular vinegar?
Yep. So I guess it's regular vinegar. I should clarify, is that like a distilled vinegar or something like that? Because there's also vinegar made from wine, so you could have like a red wine vinegar, a champagne vinegar. Those would also be great in this. I wouldn't necessarily use a distilled vinegar because I think that, to me, that's more of like a cleaning product direction. It's really harsh in flavor. This you could drink pretty much and it would be, good on its own. So you want to put something in the dough that you wouldn't mind drinking. I should say the same amount of. So I hope that clarifies that. I don't know exactly how to answer that.
Looks good. Will we be peeling the apples before slicing, or does this recipe include the peel?
I'm including the peel in this. Yeah. Perfect. So I'm gonna just grab, let's see. We talked about flour, we talked about the vinegar. The other really important step here is to make sure that you have cold water. I have a couple ice cubes just hanging out in here to make sure that this is as cold as it can possibly be when we start. And I haven't even pulled out the butter because I really want it to be as cold as possible when we start making the dough, because when you're working with a pie dough or a tart dough, you want everything to be as cold as possible. You could even throw your whole bowl with like flour and butter back into the fridge before you start mixing it, just to ensure that all of your ingredients are really cold when you start out. And I want to just back up and say that pâte rosée, which is the recipe I've given you for tart dough, is a French pie dough. And so this could also, doesn't necessarily have to just be for a free-form galette, which is like a free-form pie or tart would be under the category of a galette. So you would want, you could use this as a pie dough. I don't add any sugar to mine because I like to have the ability to use this as a savory dough or a sweet dough, and then add sugar or salt later to the dough to take it in either direction. So I'm actually just gonna grab the butter and check on that tart that I put in the oven. So we always have a lot of butter here because we all love it and we use it in everything. So I'm going to show you a couple different options. I have 4 different kinds of butter. This is just your regular conventional kind of salted butter from the grocery store, and it's, you know, a great option for this. We use this in a lot of our, you know, recipes. We actually use this Cabot huge block of butter is what we get in. So you can buy this at the grocery store. You'll probably find it in the sticks and the smaller. So this is a 1/4 pound. This is a pound of butter. So we'll be just using slightly more than a 1/4 pound of butter for this. You could also use this cultured butter, which they've started selling in just about every grocery store now. The difference here is going to be flavor. They let the actual milk solids kind of sit out and develop kind of this culture, which gives it that kind of funky flavor, a little amped up from your regular butter. Same properties, sort of works the same way, but if you like that flavor, go for it. It'll be great in your tart dough. I'm going to work with this today, just some Irish butter, European style butter. It's much deeper in color, kind of this yellow color, and I think that it's a great option for a pie dough or a tart dough. It's higher in fat content, so whereas something like this is higher in water content. So you're going to have, you would actually probably yield a flakier dough with this more conventional butter, because as it steams in the oven, you're going to get that oven spring. You'll get it with this butter, this European style butter too. But if you're looking for a more intense butter flavor, you could opt for this. And if you really want or striving for that super flaky dough, you could use this.
So are you using salted or unsalted butter?
I'm using salted butter. I always use salted butter. I love the flavor of that, but you don't have to. You could use unsalted butter for this recipe. So I'm going to kind of start with showing you how to make this. And I don't know how many of you might be following along at home. We are recording this if that's helpful, and you can watch back later when you have the ingredients. I already got a text from my brother about this and his girlfriend who wanted to follow along but didn't have the ingredients. So rest assured, you can watch back later. I'm gonna take this flour, and it's really important to start with a dry bowl. I'm not sure why there's still water in here from earlier, but we're gonna start with the dry mixing bowl. I'm gonna mix this by hand. Even though we're going to turn it out onto a table, I like to start it in a bowl rather than just on the surface, making a well like a biscuit method. I think that it's easier to control in a bowl, and then kind of turn it out as you form the dough. Also saves you a little bit of a mess later, which I think is nice when you're cooking at home. You don't want to be making a huge mess. So I think one thing I wanted to mention is when you're measuring out flour, it's really important to kind of like fluff the flour up in your container, just so you don't get any pieces. I don't think you need to sift it or anything like that. Most flour now comes in and it's very fine. It doesn't have lumps in it. So as long as you're buying fresh flours, you don't really need to sift it for this recipe. But when I'm scooping it up, I'm kind of like, I get a nice heaping cup worth of flour, and then I'm just gonna lightly scrape the top of it. So it's packed, but it's loosely packed, rather than like packing it against the side of a container or like packing it in with your hand. That's not an accurate way to use volume measure. I actually prefer usually when I'm baking to measure everything on a scale with grams, but I think when you're at home, it's just nice to sometimes grab a measuring cup from the drawer and go that route. So I'm gonna start here with the AP flour and measure this. Got a little sugar on this cup already. You can use your finger too, that's fine. You just don't want to pack it in there. Another mention with the whole wheat flour, if you're not going through it quickly and you do want to incorporate whole wheat flour into this recipe, I recommend storing it in either the freezer or the refrigerator. It tends to go rancid very quickly. We go through a lot of it here, so it stays pretty fresh just on the shelf. But if you're not using it on a regular basis, definitely throw it in the freezer or in the fridge.
Laura, I have a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
Number one, how many apples are needed for this?
So I am saying about a pound in the recipe, which is about 3 to 4, depending on the size, medium apples. So I think the ones that I've made earlier today, I used about 4, kind of this, size, small to medium apples. I have a lot of these heirloom apples, which are much smaller in comparison, and so you probably would need like 6 of these. So I would say 4 medium-sized apples is a good estimate. So right now I just have my dry ingredients in the bowl. I'm gonna add the salt as well. And I like to just whisk it together so that you're not worried about those ingredients having clumps of, a clump of salt or a clump of the whole wheat flour. And then I'm going to just sort of see where my veggies are going. I'm going to cut up the butter, which is going to be 8 ounces plus 2 ounces. Don't worry, you'll need this for the streusel topping after. So I'm going to...
Laura, how much salt is in the crust? How much salt do you put in the crust?
Yeah, so if you look on your recipe sheet, you'll notice some of the ingredients that are also either in the apples or in the streusel topping. That's why you have like an and sign, so 10 tablespoons of butter plus 4 tablespoons. That first 10 tablespoons is in this pie dough, and then the other 4 is reserved. So just make sure when you're reading through this and measuring out, if you see a and for a specific ingredient, that's a separate measurement, and it's not all going into this. So this should only be 10 tablespoons of butter right now that you're using for the pie dough, for the galette dough. I'm just using pie and galette kind of interchangeably because really they're the same dough. You could use other forms of fat if you don't, typically make a all butter pie dough. If you use some shortening or things like that. I think butter is one of the harder fats to work with. If you're kind of starting out new to making doughs, it's going to be more difficult than something like a shortening, which is a little bit more forgiving. So if you wanted to try this with half shortening, half butter, that would be a great start. You could use lard. I would stay away from other animal fats that might be more aggressive in flavor. I like to use butter also because it keeps your desserts vegetarian, and I think that for me has always been important with catering. Is always making sure you can feed a large group of people with one dessert. So I'm just using the bench scraper for the butter, and I cut it down the middle, and then I cut it into these sort of like log shapes like this. So you would have, if this was your stick of butter, you would have it in 4 pieces. And then I'm just throwing them into the bowl with the flour. So all that's in here is your flour, your salt, and now the butter. And so at this stage, before you sort of get your hands into this and start to kind of get messy mixing this, I like to have the vinegar and the water kind of close by because you're going to need those pretty soon. So you can just kind of get those set up, get your measuring spoons and whatever you need next to you. And then the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of like work through this and make sure each individual like cube of butter is coated with flour. Before we even start breaking these pieces, that is the best thing to do right now. It's just separate. See, sometimes you get like 3 of them together. Make sure you separate those and really kind of get each individual 1/4-inch cube covered with the flour mixture. And this is going to ensure that your dough is really tender and flaky. Keeping this working fast and efficient to keep all of the ingredients cold. That's why you have your water with some ice cubes in it. The butter should be coming right from the fridge. And if you find that this part is taking you a while to kind of work out, if you haven't done this before, it's totally fine to just throw this back in the fridge or the freezer for 10 minutes and then come back to it. It's more important that this is really cold rather than trying to make it all in one go. So now that all my butter is coated in the flour, I'm going to go through and just kind of like smush each piece of butter between my fingers and just kind of go through, do a pass and make sure each piece gets kind of that smush. That's kind of the most technical term I can come up with.
Laura, what's the difference between kosher salt and regular salt?
That's a great question. I think that, all of my recipes, I use kosher salt. It's something, so compared to like a table salt, which is very salty if you were to use the same amount of that. So if you were to use a tablespoon of table salt, your product would be very salty. Whereas kosher salt has larger granules and has sort of, you can see here, it's not coarse, but you can kind of like feel each granule between your hand. And this is what I season all of my food with, just for consistency. And you can add, you're gonna find that recipes that specify kosher salt, it's gonna be a higher volume of salt to get that desired flavor. But this is kosher salt is a flavor enhancer. It's not going to make your food salty. It's going to bring out it's going to enhance the flavor of whatever it is you're cooking. So I'm just going through this and making sure that I don't have any real like defined squares at this point. Everything is sort of smushed into these nice little pads of butter. And your butter, you'll notice if the butter is too warm because you won't be able to do this. You won't be able to pick this up and kind of hold this as its own thing. It'll start to just kind of incorporate into this like one big mess of butter. And again, this is a great time if you feel like you're working the dough too much with your hands. I don't know what I did with that. Behind me. You could use this pastry cutter and kind of go through. You have to be careful here though, because I find that you're not going to get those same shapes, and you can also easily overwork the dough with this just as you would with your hands. So I'm going to, now you can start to be a little bit more aggressive and kind of go through. And sometimes you'll see a recipe for pie dough that says to like mix it until the butter is the size of a pea or, you know, something like that. I like to actually have some bigger pieces of butter in my dough because I find when you roll it out, that's actually how you get a flakier, less dense crust and you get more of that tender, desirable flaky crust. So I like to have
question. Sorry, just a question on the quantity of salt in the dough. Is it 1.5 teaspoons, tablespoons?
Oh yes, so that's a teaspoon. So the bigger tea, I'm sorry, I should have specified that more carefully. But the big T, the capital T is a tablespoon, and the lowercase t is a teaspoon.
Okay, great. And so the first, when you have a double quantity, so the first quantity is for the dough and the second one is for the filling?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so now I've kind of mixed this to where I want. I can pick it up and you know, maybe I should come closer so you can see. But, you know, it kind of looks like this, and you have some bigger pieces and some smaller pieces of butter. And I think that was poor timing on my part, but I think our tart in the oven might be done. So I'm going to wash my hands real quick. So now that we have the butter and flour, I like to add the vinegar first because I want to make sure it gets in there and the dough doesn't become too hydrated before I remember to add this. Because like I mentioned, I think that it's a very important flavor enhancer, and it's also a crucial part in making sure that you get a nice tender product. So I'm just gonna evenly distribute that over the top of this. And then for the water, I just like to make like a little well in the middle, in the bowl. And the recipe that you're working with calls for about 7 tablespoons. Depending on the flour you're using, you may need less water or more water. This is why it's very hard to write an exacting pie dough recipe because it's all by feel. And you know, you want to make sure that the dough isn't overhydrated because it's going to become too sticky to work with. And when you bake it, it's going to result in sort of like a soggy pie crust or soggy bottom. And the filling is going to want to fall out from underneath it because that butter has been sort of overworked by that time, and it's not going to have really a good structure. Conversely, having a dough that's too dry is going to be very brittle, tend to break, and kind of want to crack like a cracker. And you really want this dough to kind of like flake apart and be really, really delicate and beautiful. So At this point, I'm just kind of working it. I love to use the analogy of like moon sand or Play-Doh. Some people don't think that that's a great, some of the girls that work for me, um, they don't like that one as much, but I think it's really helpful because it sort of feels to me like moon sand or Play-Doh at this stage. The butter is very pliable. The, it's holding together. When I do this, it's holding together, but it's still not one solid dough.
Or should you start with less water than you think you need and then add more as you go?
Absolutely, it's better to add less water. But that being said, you also, that's a really easy way to underhydrate the dough. Don't be afraid to add water. One thing that's helpful is when you notice that you have these pieces kind of sticking, into a dough, kind of just pull those aside in the bowl and start working that drier dough. And you can sort of hydrate, you can even just dip your fingers in a little bit of the water and kind of go over the top, rather than adding like a full tablespoon of water. And this is fine because if you're using really cold water, my butter still feels very cold, even though I've kind of been walking around and talking. So you have more time than you think, but still you don't want to like leave this out on the counter and kind of like, do this while you're watching TV or something. It's definitely like a quick process. So at this point, this is going to come together. I can feel, because I can see these kind of bigger clumps that are all forming. I don't really have like a bunch of dry flour on the bottom of my bowl. And I accidentally spilled some water, which I don't want to incorporate into this, so I'm gonna just brush this all in here. We'll worry about that later. So, if you have like even a marble or granite countertop, that you have an advantage over me because it's going to keep your dough nice and cold as you work on it and roll it into this nice disc shape that we're going for. But a wooden cutting board or just your countertop is fine for this. And I'm just kind of trying not to overwork it really. I'm just bringing it together. I can still see little pieces of butter, which I think is really important. If you don't see pieces of butter or little, I guess I can bring this up closer. But you should be able to see kind of these little pads of butter throughout the dough. And that's going to ensure that when you roll it out, it's almost like puff pastry. So when you have something on puff pastry, it's, it springs in the oven because it's just layers and layers of butter. You're sort of doing the same thing when you create a pie dough or a galette dough. You're trying to create layers of butter. So after it chills and sits and hangs out for a bit, that you kind of get that nice oven spring, which gives you that kind of crack and flake that you're going for. So this.
One question right now: should we start preheating the oven at this point?
If you're baking it now, yes, you could do that.
Great.
I would say if you're making this right now and you have a freezer, this next step you're going to want to pop it in the freezer because I think you're going to speed up the chilling process. So.
And do you need to put flour on the surface that you're rolling the dough on? Because what keeps it from being like a sticky mess?
So if it's sticky, that means that you've overhydrated, or yes, so you've added probably too much water, and you're going to want to add a little bit of flour to that. Just, the same way that we're adding water really carefully, you want to add the flour very carefully because, one, it's hard to incorporate the flour into a dough that's sort of already coming together and very sticky. And you also don't want to make it really tough at this point. So the final dough, you should be able to kind of like freely pick it up. It shouldn't stick. It should feel hydrated. I shouldn't keep using the word hydrated because maybe that doesn't mean anything. But it should feel moist and kind of supple, and you can indent your hand in it and it's not going to stick. And that's a good sign. If a piece is kind of like this, it's okay. That's fine, because we don't want to overwork it, and I don't want it to be a perfect little disc of dough. I actually would rather have kind of like pieces kind of flaking off or seeing pieces of butter. That's a good indication that it's not overworked. So at this point, we're going to wrap the dough, and that's something I did not put near me, was the plastic wrap. So we're just going to imagine that we're going to wrap this in plastic, nice and tight. Or you could, if you don't have plastic wrap, you could use a plastic bag, or a beeswax wrap or something like that. Just something to keep it airtight. Air is going to dry it out, which you don't want to do. But we do want to put it in the refrigerator or freezer for, I would say, at least half an hour to an hour before rolling it out, because that's going to let the gluten strands relax. If you try to roll it out right now, it's going to want to spring back on itself, and that's going to create a dough that seems, tough and hard to work with. It's going to be hard to eat because it's going to be very cracker-like. And so really letting your dough rest at this point is important. And at this point, you could wrap this and put it in the freezer for 6 months. You could put it in your fridge for 2 weeks, wrapped really tightly in plastic wrap. If you're making a bunch of pie or a bunch of galettes for the holidays and you just want to make all of your dough one day, I think that's a great idea. And I would just recommend wrapping them really tight. And if you're, like I said, using it within 2 weeks, just keep it in your refrigerator and pull it out maybe half hour before you want to roll it out. And then the best way to defrost it from the freezer is, I would say, overnight in the refrigerator. But if you need it in a pinch, just pull it, and hopefully within an hour, hour and a half, it should be ready to roll out. We freeze a lot of tart dough here, just because sometimes we need it and we're doing a lot of production with it, and it's helpful to have on hand and not have to spend a couple hours making tart dough. So I'm going to put this aside, and I'm just going to clean up my surface here, and you can get caught up at home on making your dough, and then we can talk about the filling. And this tart's been in the oven for about 35 minutes, and it's just about done. I think it's really important to let it cool on the sheet tray at this point before you cut it or serve it. It's still really nice to serve them when they come out of the oven warm, but I would still let it kind of set up and chill out for a few minutes before you do anything. I would say a good rule of thumb is if you can pick up the tray with your hand, then it's probably fine to cut it in two. But if you still need to use a towel to get the tart, you should wait a few minutes. We don't have the swaps like we would on the Food Network or something like that. Cut to a commercial and you can get cleaned up or something. This is where your bench scraper is really handy. I like it at home, even just cleaning up, or while you're cooking on your cutting board. Cut vegetables or something into like a saute pan. You can just scoop them up with this. It's the best $5 you'll spend for your kitchen. Maybe, I don't know. Hopefully. gonna do just while I have it here is I'm going to put together the kind of the crumble topping. And this is totally optional. It would be delicious just with the apples. You don't need that, but I think it's nice. Adds a little bit of warmth and spice to the dish. So I have.
Laura, what was the cutting utensil called again?
Oh, you know what? Where is it? I don't have a metal one. The bench scraper is sometimes called a pastry knife or a bench scraper or bench knife. You can search it under that name and it'll come up. I'm gonna actually grab that because I got rid of it.
So do we have a lot of folks cooking along? If you're cooking along, write it in the Q&A. Let me know. I'm curious to see if you're cooking along.
I had a lot more of these, and now I don't know where they are. But we've had a very busy day here between making challah bread and donuts and all kinds of things in the restaurant. So we smells very strange in here, actually. There's a lot going on. So I'm gonna grab just my other 4 ounces of butter for the topping. You might find that you don't want to add all of this crumble topping to your galette, but I wanted to be generous with that quantity so that, you know, some people really like having that. Gives it kind of a crunchy top like a pie, and then crunchy bottom with a nice soft warm filling. So I think that contrast is really nice. But if you don't want it for the appearance, or you don't want it just to simplify the dish a little bit, I think it's great just on its own. So I'm just cutting that butter just as I did for the pie dough with my. Move this so you can see. And I'm just doing this a little quicker than I did the dough, because it doesn't really matter if you combine the whole thing. You can't really overwork this part. You're almost making more of a cookie. So the butter and the sugar together, and you could even do this in a mixer if you wanted to. I'm also happy to show the dough in the mixer if anyone wants to see that. And then the oats. So I just have
all right, I have a couple questions regarding the topping. So is the topping, that's part of the recipe they received, right? What you're making right now is part of the recipe they have. Yep. And is it going to be okay to just load it on for this recipe for the crumble?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this, you know, just kind of like at your own risk. If you want all of it on there, go for it. If you just want half of it, you know, you can store it in the fridge, use it for another pie, or put it in the freezer. You can eat it raw. You can bake it. I don't know. You can do like all kinds of things. You could bake off the rest of it onto some parchment paper and like have it over ice cream, and that would be delicious.
Yum, yum. So it's not the filling you're making right now. It's just the crumble on top.
Just the topping, just so that we have it kind of there when we need it. I'm gonna actually, at this point, I have lots of Tart dough chilling, so my refrigeration runs very cold. So I'm gonna pull mine a little earlier than you might have to if you're letting it rest for an hour. This is just dough I made earlier today. So I'm just gonna leave that there to hang out. All right, so I'm just working this really quickly, getting the butter and sugar all combined. And it really kind of comes together and looks like sugar cookie dough or something like that. Don't be afraid to combine this whole thing. And the butter at this point, if it's at room temperature, that's going to just make it easier for you. So I just kind of get this almost like little dough ball all together, and we'll just put that aside, and then we can piece that over the top later.
Laura, if you had a preference, do you prefer to cook desserts mostly, or you love doing the meals? What's your favorite?
I really prefer savory. That's like my background. That's my training. I'm not a pastry chef by any stretch. I have been doing a lot more pastry things this year than I've ever done in my life for the restaurant because that's what they need. And so we've been doing a lot of tarts, a lot of desserts, and bread for them. And so I've learned a lot this year, which is great in doing that, but it's definitely not my background. And I've actually grown to enjoy it, but I wouldn't say that it was something I enjoyed right from the beginning. Something I definitely struggled with in culinary school. I found baking very frustrating because it's not forgiving in the same way that cooking is, where you can sort of add things later. You can kind of adapt if you don't have certain ingredients. Baking is very particular, and I think that if you aren't following a recipe or you can't really just you can't just make it up as you go. Whereas cooking, you can be creative in both, but I think baking has some parameters that you can't go outside of. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you want a desired result. So I'm gonna put this aside just so that I have some space. Before I move on to the filling, I would love to know if anyone wants me to show you the mixer version of the dough before I get kind of too far beyond that. But I guess my main tip I guess I'll just kind of show you briefly without turning it on. You want to do that same initial step of combining the flour. So we have our two different flours here, just like that. So that was the whole wheat and the all-purpose flour that we did before. Salt right in there. And then I'm just gonna whisk that together. This might seem counterintuitive to use a mixer if you're kind of still doing this by hand, but the reason that I'm doing it this way is because if you just put all the ingredients in there, all of the butter is going to want to cling around your paddle, and you're going to get a really either overworked dough, or it's going to have the butter unevenly dispersed. So that's why this first step is something to still take some care and time with. And so then if you were adding your butter, which I self-sabotaged and used all the butter. So we're just going to pretend that this is the right amount. You would still want to piece it in there, the cubes of butter, and mix coat those with flour by hand. So this part is still do by hand. You don't have to get it to that fine, you don't have to break the butter down into those pea-size things. That's what the mixer is for. But that initial quarter-inch cube of butter, just give it a toss a few times before you put the paddle in there, because it's going to make all the difference in making sure that the final product is a really well worked dough.
So when you actually are using a mixer, will the hand mixer do the job, or do you need a stand mixer?
You can use a hand mixer, totally. That would be it would be the same thing. I would still go through and just kind of coat all that butter with your hand. The benefit of using a mixer for this is that you have a lot more control with the amount of liquid you're adding. And instead of trying to feel it and add more, you can just see it and you can add more and then kind of reach in. It's a little bit, you have a little bit more control in some sense. So I think that, I learned how to make this particular dough, pâte brisée with the vinegar, in a mixer and not by hand. And then when I was developing recipes for Blue Door and I wanted a tart dough that was a little bit more versatile and I could use for a lot of applications, I kind of engineered it so that we can make a lot of it in a mixer. So I think you can get a great result by doing it this way. And this recipe scales up. So if you wanted to make like 4 times a recipe, I would recommend just doing it in your mixer, and saves you some time, some mixing, and definitely a big mess on your counter. So especially around the holidays, if you're making a lot of tart dough, that's a great direction. So now we have our dough. It should be chilling if you're making this kind of along with me, and you have this kind of streusel topping in the works. If you find that it's a little too sticky, you could add more oats to it. And now we'll get started on the apples. I also, if you have some other seasonal fruit, throw that in there too. I have some of these beautiful cranberries, which add a nice little pop of color to it. I also found, where are they? These little persimmons, which I've never seen them so tiny and cute, but those would be an awesome addition. Cut them in half and put a little bit of ricotta or something underneath it.
So Laura, what is your favorite dessert to eat? What's your all-time favorite dessert?
I love ice cream. That's probably my go-to, but
Tom's ice cream.
I'm like around sweets all the time right now. I'm really just not even not even thinking about desserts when I like want something bad. I'm like more like I want potato chips at this point. But that's anyway. I'm gonna get some of this stuff out of the way. So bear with me. So I'm going to, I have a bowl that I'm going to use to chop the apples up into. And I'm going to just pick from what I have in front of me. I really am a big fan of the flavor and color of these Black Oxford apples from Maine. So I'm going to pick that one. I'm going to pick a Honey Crisp also for the nice color and crunch and sweetness. And then one of these kind of more heirloom ones because they have a great tartness to them. And then we'll do a Macintosh and a Cortland, just because I think that maybe one of these Northern Spies, because I think that that will make a great tart. And I'm going to actually move this out of the way so that so I can see you all a little bit more. Well, actually, I can only see Tammy, but imagining you're all here. I am going to use my chef knife, but you could use whatever knife you have. A little paring knife is great too. You could even do little wedges or anything like that, but I'm going to show you how I like to cut them for this. So I sort of do a utility cut. So I just cut these like cheeks off of the apple. So you get these two like half moon shapes. And then I cut those two little weird end pieces left behind. So then I just have this core. And I'm just going to come through with my knife with the skin on and go really carefully trying to get these kind of 1/8 of an inch thick half moons. And this is what I chose for this particular tart, but you could even cut this in half if you want smaller chunks of apples, or you could do cubes. I just find that a smaller cut like this is going to break down nicely in the oven. You want something that's going to be finished cooking by the time your tart is finished cooking, so you don't have raw apples with a finished tart dough.
Laura, how many apples do you have there? Because we thought perhaps you might have said 4 apples, but you might have more there. Is there any amount that you should use for this?
Yeah, I have 5, but I had 2 that were really tiny, so they kind of make up the 4th apple. So.
And you're not peeling the apples, right? This is an unpeeled apple galette.
Yeah, so again, I'm just using the skin because these are some nice local apples I got in that have a really, you can always try them before before you put them in your tart, and make sure that they, if they taste really good when you're eating them, and you don't feel like that skin is super tannic and kind of like lingering in an unpleasant way, then go for it and just kind of add them to your tart. And I'm just going through this kind of, quickly here. If you have a mandolin, or if that's like your preferred way to get thin slices of something, it's a really nice way to get these uniform cuts like this. And this is actually how you form those apple roses that you saw on that tart. And so I just soak them in a little bit of warm water just to soften them, so that when you go to fold them, you get that nice rose. And this is a great project if you're making this with a partner, because you can have somebody sort of making these, and then the other person can assemble them onto the tart. It's maybe not the best beginner or like entry level tart, because it can be a little bit frustrating to get them all lined up like that. But a very fun project and a very beautiful tart for the holidays. So I'm just gonna put.
Laura, if people were to peel them though, is it just that they would lose the color, but they could still peel them if they wanted to?
Absolutely, you can totally peel them. If that is your preferred way to eat it, go for it, because I think at the end of the day, you're the one eating this, and you want to make it delicious for you. And I think that there's no harm in peeling the apples. That's definitely how most people in my family, I have a family of really awesome home bakers and cooks, and they would all probably peel their apples. I don't know any of them that would do it this way. This is just something I want to do because I have all of these gorgeous apples, and I want to showcase the color. And I feel like sometimes apple desserts can be a little bit monochromatic. They're kind of just look brown or like golden all across, which can be very beautiful. But I think if you're trying to add a little bit of a wow factor to it, definitely go for the skin or even half skin on the apple, just to give yourself some of those beautiful fall colors at the table. And then I just like to kind of compost the middle part here. We have some chickens, local chickens, that love eating these. So I put them in a separate bin for them. And then we get some of their beautiful little eggs in return. So it's a win-win situation. I don't have to throw away a lot of food, and we get some nice farm eggs in return.
So Laura, tell me, with you being the chef in the family, are you the one responsible for a Thanksgiving meal, or does the whole family share in the duties?
Well, this year it's sort of an interesting holiday, I'm sure, for everyone. We are not doing our normal Thanksgiving, but usually we spend a lot of the day in the car, my family, going to see a lot of our family, which we won't be doing this year. So it might actually be a pretty relaxing holiday. And I do not typically do a lot of the cooking. It's sort of like my aunt's holiday. And so she
nice.
typically does all of it, and I make some appetizers and some fun things, but I don't have to worry about the whole meal, which is a nice break for me. But this year we're doing a kind of a pre-order Thanksgiving for Coco and the Cellar Bar. So if you're local and you're looking for some help with your holiday prep, you can just order single sides as you need them, or you can order the whole thing. It's available right now. That's my little plug for them. And yeah, I think I'll probably end up doing the Thanksgiving for my very immediate family, but that's about all I have planned. I don't even know what aside from the classics, I don't know what else I'll be making, because I'll probably be working the morning of. So it might, yeah.
Sorry.
family that is watching this, you know, if you want to bring anything, art recipe for you.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Tula?
Absolutely. Tula is a new business as of this year, but well, actually, I'm just going to talk real quickly about what I'm going to do the apples. That when I go into that, I'm just adding a little bit of salt, flavor enhancer. I like to add salt kind of every step of the way. I'm counting the salt in that streusel topping in the butter. I don't think you really need to add more, but if you wanted to, I am all for more salt. Much to my mother's dismay. But I'm just adding a little bit of salt, sugar, and cinnamon to the apples. Very like classic pairing. You have measurements, but I'm just sort of eyeballing this, which you can too. I think that's the great thing about tart fillings is you can sort of riff on different things. So if you don't have, you know, if you only have cardamom, you could use cardamom instead of cinnamon, or you know, any other warm baking spice blend that you might have would be great in here. So I'm going to just mix those, mix this together, add a little bit more cider vinegar to this. I think it's a nice complement to the tart dough. Also is going to enhance the flavor of those apples. It's not going to taste like vinegar, I promise. It's just going to enhance the flavors that are already there. So I'm going to let these hang out in the sugar. Just make sure they're all nicely coated. This isn't a super sweet dessert, and I do that intentionally because that's my preference. But if you really want a sweet dessert, you could add a little bit more sugar at this point into your apples, and that would make it a sweeter kind of filling. And I'll show you once we're rolling it out some options there to give it a little bit more sweetness. Then I like desserts that are leaning a little bit savory, so that's why the tart doesn't have any sugar in it, and that's why we're kind of keeping the apples with just a little bit of salt, sugar, and cinnamon, just to kind of keep their natural flavors present and forward. I'm going to wash my hands and we can talk about Tula.
And Laura, if there's a website that you could give us where they could order Thanksgiving meals from Coco.
Yeah, yep. So, well, I'll start with that. The best way to do that is you can go to bluedoorgatherings.com or cocointhecellarbar.com, and we have links there. And we also have them through our social media pages. So the best way for me to get kind of the most up-to-date information is Instagram or my website. And if you go to my website, there's a pop-up form and you can sign up for a newsletter. And we try and keep that pretty up to date with different happenings. This year it's been a little bit slower just because we haven't found as much going on in terms of like public events. But you can definitely go to Coco and the Cellar Bar's menu right now and pre-order.
All right, and as a follow-up to this event, just to let all the attendees know, I'll send out all of your website information so they'll have links to view everything.
Thank you. And then Tula, you can find us at livetula.com, LIVETULA.com. And we started as sort of a local meal subscription plan. And what we're focusing on is this reset box that comes out once a week. And we're working to get that to a broader community of people and offer it a little bit more frequently than one day a week. But it is a day's worth of meals. So you get breakfast, snacks, lunch, dinner, different teas and tinctures that are all plant-based and nutrient-dense. So it's sort of a different cuisine for both Uni and I, but we both lean that way in our own personal eating. And so we were really excited to kind of make the food that we wanted to eat for people, to share with people. And so we've been kind of offering it to the public since July, and we've had a very gracious and warm response, and we're growing as quickly as we can and kind of keep up with it. But right now we're offering the reset box and other items in our online store on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and hopefully kind of going into the holiday season and into next year, we'll have more availability with that.
Great.
Yeah.
A couple questions here. If, let's see, if I have a really fine baking sugar, would that be okay? Or should it be regular cane sugar?
Oh, so is that for, you might be looking at, are you looking at the Demerara sugar? Or is that the sugar for the apples? For the apples, you can just use regular granulated sugar. That's totally fine. That's what I just used. And then the reason I have the Demerara sugar at the bottom is for the crust. And that gives you a really sparkly kind of final finished product. So that kind of like glimmer, that hard crust is from that sugar, and it's very similar to like sugar in the raw or something like that. It's similar in flavor to like a brown sugar. It's very molasses forward, kind of maple notes in it. So I think it works really well with these kind of fall desserts. And I just like how it looks. I love that kind of sparkle that it gives to the crust, and it also gives it a nice like crack when you bite into it.
Besides apples, what are your other favorite galette flavors?
I would say, so I am not a huge apple dessert fan, but I, like lots of people in my family, love apples. So it's something I make pretty often. I love stone fruit, like peaches, plums, anything in that realm and world I love. And I love citrus. So I think, doing something in those directions is definitely more my preference. I also love kind of a sweet and savory tart. So my favorite galette of all times is in August. I make a sun gold galette with the orange little sweet tomatoes that come out, and I just put them whole on the tart with honey and some thyme and ricotta on the base. And that's the best tart in my opinion. My favorite. So at this point, your dough should probably be chilled, and we can roll this out. We're running overtime, I think. I was worried about not having enough to say, but it looks like the opposite.
I know we didn't think we'd be able to go an hour, but we're pushing an hour and a half now.
Well, I can end it. I can wrap it up soon because I respect your time. And
It's great. It's great.
So one, like this, is probably the most important part, is kind of taking this tart dough. It should be really cold. It shouldn't be easy to roll out. You should have to work for it. I just put a light dusting of flour down. I like to just flour once. I don't like to really have to come back. So I push some of that extra to the side if I need to pick it up. But I just have a light dusting on either side of this. And then as I'm rolling, I'm just sort of flipping this around and constantly rotating the tart from front to back and around in a circle. And that's what keeps it round. And it also keeps it even by doing that. So you don't have thicker sides and like this shallow belly in the middle. And it just keeps it this nice circle that you've kind of been working towards. If you don't want to do a circle either, that's totally fine. You could roll it out into a rectangle and make kind of like a rectangle, and that's really good for sharing. It's easy to cut in either strips or into squares or something like that. It would be a great appetizer if you made a tart and you just kind of cut it into squares. So I'm just gonna roll this out. And like I said, you're just kind of flipping it over. If you need flour, that's fine. A good sign that your dough is like perfectly hydrated is when you don't really need any extra flour. It's not sticky, it's not dry. You shouldn't really have to add anything to it except maybe a little flour on your rolling pin, on your pans. And really what I'm rolling this on has no flour really whatsoever, just enough that I can kind of push it back and forth. So I'm just gonna roll this out. And I'm just trying to get this to about 1/4 of an inch thick. Don't be afraid to like pick it up off the table. It shouldn't break on you if it's mixed nice and. You will see kind of these like strands of butter through it, which I think is really beautiful, and that's a good sign that this is going to make a nice flaky dough. So I'm just going to keep going here until, you know, this is sort of like your average pie crust size. So if you have a pie plate or something like that, this bowl happens to be about the same size. You can kind of just use that as a guide for yourself. And then I'm just gonna, before I put any filling on this, it's really important to grab your baking tray.
How big is the area of the dough when it's rolled out?
So I would say it's about 14 inches across. It's a little bigger than a foot. So if you had like a 9-inch pie pan, you would have a 2-inch border around. So I would say the diameter is probably 14 inches. And you can sort of like pull it into that circle shape that you want. Don't be afraid at this point to get it in that shape that you really want. And then I'm just going to lift it up and put it onto a parchment sheet. And then put these apples right into the center. Don't be afraid to like have this nice like heap of apples here, because they're going to kind of cook down almost like a pie would. And then there's a few different things you can do at this point. You can, I'm just gonna, since I have some parchment here, it makes it really easy to lift it on and off. And I hope that this is easier to see than if I'm working on this tray, but you can just do it right on your tray before it goes in the oven. So one fold you could do is just simply like lifting, this is the traditional galette, where you're just folding 5 or so folds here into this kind of shape, just like this. And this would be a beautiful tart dough. You could also fold in the dough. So you have this here where you have no filling underneath the sides like this. You're just kind of loosely forming the dough around. And then I like to come back through and lift it up, like make a wall. And then I just, almost as if I was crimping a pie shell, with my hands like this and kind of like cutting into my own hand to get this nice shape, free form shape. And that gives you a little bit more of like a braided, it's gonna bake it kind of like bake into itself, so it won't necessarily look like this after it comes out of the oven, but it's not going to be flat like this. It'll look more like this, where you have kind of these higher peaks and shallow. So this is actually the tart that is your recipe, just without the crumble topping, just so I could show you what that looks like. Sorry, now I'm nervous that I'm over time, and so I'm just flying. I'm gonna go through this quickly.
No worries, no worries.
Anyone, you have the recipe, so if you need to sign off, we'll miss you, but.
And some people are cooking real time with you, so it's good.
Okay, good. I'll be here all night. So I'm just gonna leave it like this because I've already done this. I'm not gonna try and undo it and then put it back together, but put it back on our sheet with some parchment. got 2 pieces of parchment here. You only need 1. I like to make an egg wash for the dough, and that's going to ensure that you have a really nice, crisp, and browned crust. If you just put it in the oven like this, it'll be fine, but you'll definitely have a paler looking tart dough, which is totally okay. I like a darker, more caramelized crust, and so that's why I go for an egg wash. Your egg wash can also just be an egg yolk that's been whisked. I am going to add a little bit of heavy cream to this just because I like the richness that adds in the color. So just about a teaspoon of heavy cream to an egg yolk. I think in your recipe it just says 1 egg yolk, and you can just whisk that up. I don't put any salt in this. There's already enough in the recipe. Some people, I've seen recipes where they put sugar in the egg yolk. I wouldn't do that because you're just going to encourage the tart dough to caramelize, and you might get little spots that look burnt. So I would just do the egg yolk and the heavy cream, and it should be this nice kind of like very pale yellow color. And then more isn't better here. You don't want to just add a ton of this like and glop it all over. You want to be really choice and like delicate about it, because you don't want scrambled eggs on your tart dough. You just want a very fine coating of egg wash on your pastry, not on the apples or anything like that. And you can save that egg wash for other applications. It's fine in the fridge for, let's say, up to a week, but it's not very many ingredients if you're just gonna discard the rest of it. You don't have to feel too bad about that. We tend to have like a lot of it on hand for different things. So that's why I said if you just wanna forego that step, that's totally fine. If you're making a savory tart, you could brush a little olive oil on it. You could brush a little butter on it, but I would do that after it's baked for a little while, because you don't want the crust to be done before your filling is. And it really needs that like 30, 35 minutes at least in the oven. So I just broke that up almost like I was like playing with cookie dough right over the top of my tart. Just like that. And then I'm just gonna put this in the oven. And I do have some other tarts that I made earlier today, so I can show you those while you're waiting. So a good sign that your tart is baked completely is you should be able to move it freely on your baking sheet. This is a little bit oversized. I would say most home cookie sheets are half this size to fit in an oven, but you should be able to like move it freely on the parchment itself. If it sticks on the bottom, that means that it's probably still raw, and if it's not cooked all the way on the bottom, you're gonna get a really gummy, soggy bottom. Your filling's just gonna seep right through. So the sign that it's done is you should just be able to pick up the tart and hold it. So this is completely cooled. This was the rose apple one. This is not the recipe, but like I said, just cutting them very thin, soaking them in water, you'll get that nice rose colored thing. And the bottom, I like it this color. This is like the perfect bottom for me. But if you don't want it to be that golden brown, you can definitely take it out about 5 minutes sooner. But I promise that it tastes better when it's cooked this way. I made one of these tarts 3 days ago, and it was still, I tried a little piece of it earlier today, and it was great. I would definitely recommend warming it up if you're going to eat it, but you can definitely hold on to it a few days, and if you're going to bring it over to someone's house, I recommend making it that day. But if you just, want it on your counter for a few days, it's great. It holds up perfectly.
Laura, when you pulled it out of the oven, what did you add? Did you add something to it right when you pulled it out?
When I pulled it out of the oven,
Or when you pulled something over? When you pulled one of the galettes over, you added something to the top. They were just asking what you added. Did you add anything?
I don't think so. I don't know. I definitely didn't add anything to these.
Okay.
You know what I did forget to do is add the demerara sugar or any even granulated sugar would be great to that crust that's in the oven now. So it's fine just like that. It just won't be sparkly like this.
Mm-hmm.
This one actually, this rose one doesn't have it. But if you want a little additional sweetness, or if you love that aesthetic for your tart, definitely after you egg wash it, just sprinkle this liberally over it. And I use this pretty generously. I make sure everything is coated. I think if you're gonna go for this, just go for it, because if you just have a little bit, it's gonna darken in those spots, and it actually won't look. It won't have that desired uniform color when you take it out of the oven. So I also have this one, which is similar, like I said, to what you're making. And then I have a piece of, where is it? This is a piece with the strudel on it, crumbled, so you can see just like that. I like your hat, Tam. We used to have to wear those in culinary school every day, part of our uniform.
I put it on because I definitely feel like a chef now after listening to you. This is awesome. And I'm sure everybody who's listening feels like a chef.
I was so worried I was going to not be able to talk the whole time. And so I made so many extra things to make for you. But,
I was going to say, who is going to help you eat all of those galettes?
To the restaurant for a family meal. I'm not going to eat any of them, except maybe a little piece of this one that's already cut. But this is a lot of tarts. I have another one in the oven. I have this one, which is the tart that you're making, where I just kind of fold it over the sides. So there's this one. And like I said, you can just like pick them up, which is a great sign that it's perfectly done. This is a tart that was not so lucky and is kind of, so this is an example of a soggy tart dough. So this is a tart dough that wasn't chilled enough and just went straight into the oven. Something I recommend if you're doing this, you can actually assemble the tart exactly how we did, pop it in the fridge, like overnight even, or for another hour or half hour if you have it. That's going to make a huge difference in making sure that that crust comes out really nice, because the more you let the butter kind of go from the temperature extremes of cold and hot, you're going to get that steam, that oven spring that creates that flaky tender dough. So this is a dough that kind of got temperature abused, which is sort of sad because it's a whole tart that didn't really make it. But it's sort of like rehydrating on itself, and the bottom looks very greasy. It looks, you can like see the butter kind of seeping through. There's a chance that the butter was also like overworked into the dough. And so, it's very dense, and it almost has like a rubbery consistency. And so if you're worried about that, something else too is like if your filling was too wet, that could happen, but it shouldn't happen. Like the cranberries are very wet, and this tart is totally solid on the bottom, and that's largely because the dough is the right temperature and kind of like withstand that. So I'll put this one away.
Let's see, a question. If someone's cooking in a Breville countertop oven, should he place the galette on the bottom rack?
Sorry, I missed that. What kind of oven?
It says Breville countertop oven.
Okay, I'm not totally familiar. Is it like a kind of like a warming oven? Maybe not like a
It's a convection oven too.
convection is great. I would recommend if you have a convection oven or a convection setting on your oven, that just helps evenly distribute the air and kind of blows around the air. And it gives it a more even distribution of heat. So that would be the best case. If you are worried about your oven not necessarily getting hot enough, you could bake this in a cast iron pan, um, which would kind of help insulate it. If you had a pizza stone, you could put that underneath the sheet tray or kind of double up on a sheet tray just to give yourself more contact with the bottom. Make sure that the bottom really cooks. So those are some solutions that I hope are helpful.
And so should he still cook for 25 to 30 minutes?
It should be about 45 minutes, I would say. And you don't be afraid to leave it in there longer. I think that everyone, has different settings on their home ovens run at different temperatures, usually lower than like a commercial oven, which mine tends to run hotter. So I think you're going for more of a final result. So the best thing to look for is kind of a crust that has a little bit of like you can kind of like tap it and it's not going anywhere. I would say don't be afraid that you're over baking it if it's this color, because see the bottom is still really beautiful and golden. And this is just apples. So this is the same tart. If you just same recipe, no streusel topping, and no cranberries. I didn't throw any cranberries on this.
If let's see, could you easily substitute apples for cranberries, or would you need to modify much to make that work flavor-wise? So can you swap it in out cranberries for the apples? And
yeah, I really love the flavor of like a roasted whole cranberry. They're very tart. Cooking them does bring out the sweetness. I would say you're going to need to add more sugar, or I would add more sugar to them. I had a little bit of some crab apples, so I actually put that in with those cranberries. So it's a very like tart filling, which I like. But if you don't want it so tart, definitely add some maple syrup, some honey, sugar, anything like that. Just be careful that there's not a ton of liquid. You still want a fairly dry filling, because once it bakes, it's gonna, like you saw that mound of apples that sort of cooks down to look like this. And so you just want to be really careful that you're not adding too much extra liquid, because that's gonna just run out the sides or bottom of your tart or something like that. So, once it's cool like this, if you wanted to pop it back in the oven for about 10 minutes before you serve it, you could definitely do that. And, if you also just wanted to heat up one piece of it, cut it when it's cool. It's a lot easier to cut when it's cool, because you can pick it up and make sure you're getting a really nice, even cut of that. So just like that. And you can see that the filling on this side, at least, you can see that the filling is running all the way through to the end of the crust. So you're getting a little bit of apple and a little bit of tart in every bite. And then, I really love just some creme fraiche on baked goods. I think it's tart and it kind of adds like that creamy bite that you might be missing. You could also use vanilla ice cream. You could actually let your ice cream thaw completely into a liquid and, creme anglaise, add a little bit of that to the plate just to give it some creaminess and, an additional component. And then I'm not going to forget about that tart, but I don't want to keep you all for, as long as that's going to take, but I'm happy to take any questions or anything like that, or help you in the process of whatever you're making right now.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please.
Where you're at in the stage of making your tart.
We have people saying, thank you, this was awesome. I second that. Great job.
Thank you.
This has been fabulous. I'm ready to bake. Thank you for sharing. Great tips.
Awesome. And all of this applies to a savory filling. My favorite thing, just a couple pointers if you're going to take this in a savory direction. I love to start with a base of either like ricotta or some sort of like spreadable cheese type of base is always kind of great. And it doesn't make the tart a ricotta tart, but it just kind of gives it a base to everything to hold on to. If you're doing like a squash or something like that, I like to pre-roast it, so it's just a little bit. Let's see. So this is just a squash tart I made earlier with a little blue cheese, delicata squash, and then I have some crispy toasted sage to put on top of it. Second, herbs like this make a beautiful garnish. But just kind of, if you stick to that formula of like cheese, a roasted vegetable, and then an herb garnish, you're gonna have a beautiful end result. You could do a mushroom, taleggio, and thyme would be a great tart this time of year. But I just sort of pre-roast things lightly so that you don't end up with a fully cooked tart and some raw squash wouldn't be very pleasant. So just kind of fork tender before you put it on the tart for any sort of root or squash vegetable. Even mushrooms, I pre-roast them before I put them on a tart.
Laura, a question, is it a good idea to turn the galette midway?
Yeah, if you feel it, so sort of the older your oven, or sometimes if the bottom or sides haven't been cleaned, you get hot spots where things tend to cling. I know my oven definitely has it, so I'll kind of like spin it around, move it up and down on racks. Best case is kind of if you are baking on the bottom of the oven, you're gonna get more direct contact with the bottom of your tart. So I think that for something like a galette, that's actually desirable. I think that's a great idea.
Great. All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, this was fabulous. Laura, thank you so much. I know it's a long day for you, but we appreciate it. It was just awesome.
Over. I was so worried about not having enough, but I guess I have the gift of gab sometimes. So.
I think it's great. We survived our first webinar together. Yay. So I wanted to thank everybody who stayed with us. Such a great evening. I want to remind you to tune in next Thursday. We're doing a wine education talk with Gordon Sullivan, class of 69. So that should be great. And we have a lot more fun, engaging, interactive events coming up, and we hope to see you all soon. So thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
You can come to our kitchen someday.
All right. Bye-bye.